Welcome to California in Focus. I'm your host, Keegan Kernodle. Joining me today is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Today we're talking about state data that shows Cal Fire funded just one brush clearance before the Palisades Fire. Can you tell me more about this?
Yeah, Keegan. So there was just one Cal Fire funded fuel reduction I found in their database that covers 2023 to the present of operations they did in the Palisades. They funded 184 acres of scrubland clearance across the 75,000 acre Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority. They did this clearance in about November through December of 2024. But when you look at the map of their projects, when you look at where the fire burned, what you see is they did one very, very small operation in the Palisades, just along the sides and the start of Temescal Canyon Fire Road. Very, very, very small area. And while they focused all of their real main efforts on building a firewall by cutting through the space between the Palisades and Brentwood along somewhere called Mandeville Canyon Road. And ultimately, that's where the fire stopped. So these efforts at least were successful in protecting the rest of the city, but they unfortunately left the Palisades mostly unprotected, which is why this fire ended up burning tens of thousands of acres, killed 12 Americans, and destroyed 6,837 structures.
Now, meanwhile, in your article, you do mention how Governor Newsom is blaming the Trump administration. Even he's hosting a Make America Rake Again event. Can you tell me more about this?
Right. So when California had its really bad wildfires, soon after Newsom became governor, Donald Trump, who's president at the time, and is again said that California just needs to actually do a better job of raking its forests. Two ways to really manage forests and reduce the risk of wildfire are to either do controlled burns or manually remove the underbrush, which colloquially, I guess, is raking the forest. So Governor Newsom at this event where he issued a, mock executive order for President Trump to sign to provide greater funding and resources for federal forest management efforts, he said, "California has done more than our fair share of raking the forests. Now the federal government has to do its part to make America rake again. We're doing all we can to protect communities from catastrophic wildfire. Will President Trump?" I don't think that the residents of the Palisades would say that California has done its fair share of, quote, raking the forests, and that the state has done all it can to protect communities from catastrophic wildfire, because the Palisades is surrounded by state land. We have Topanga State Park, which is where it seems like the fire started. And also the fire, the January fires started, I believe, before Trump was inaugurated as president. So, we can't really blame those fires on Trump. Something else we have to note is that there was 2 years of pretty much record rain, 2 years in a row before these fires. So we had a huge amount of overgrowth that resulted from that. Yes, the forests were green and everything was blooming, but coming into this year, we had drought. So all of that overgrowth turned into deadly tinder. And that's really one of the big factors for why we're probably going to have such a bad fire season this year. Now, something else that people should note is that, the coastal areas of Southern California have something called a chaparral ecosystem. And this is just how it's been. There are winter rains that produce spring blooms that dry out over the summer, and then you have fires in the fall. And then you also have some fires in the summer. And these fires then provide nutrients for the time when it blooms yet again after it starts raining again in the winter. And fires before this area was settled were extremely common. So the entire state's equivalent of land burned every 23 years. So 4 times a century, the equivalent of all of California burned. So this is just how the natural state is in California. And unfortunately, we've really adopted a fire suppression instead of forest management policy. So we spend most of our money on responding to fires instead of preventing fires. And as I mentioned earlier, there's really only two ways to manage these forest lands. You can do prescribed burns, or you can just physically remove them. You can do something called mastication, where you feed brush and smaller trees into mulching machines. That works. You also can do manual brush clearance, or you do some combination of methods. And the state of California says about a third of the state managed land in this is at high risk of uncontrolled wildfire, and that in total, about 15 million acres of land in California needs some kind of treatment for wildfire risk. When we look at Cal Fire's project dashboard, it shows that they're not doing as much as we probably should, given the severity of the backlog. Cal Fire funded 141,000 acres of fuel reduction in between July 2023 and June 2024, and 124,000 acres in the year before. So Cal Fire's project dashboard shows that they did about 141,000 acres between summer of 2023 and summer of 2024, and 124,000 or so acres between summer of 2024 and May of this year. We don't have that June data yet, but we'll see how much they actually did at that time. But at this pace, it would take about 7 years to clear the backlog on just the state's lands, and that doesn't include new lands added to the state's backlog, and that doesn't include federal or private lands. One thing that was worth noting is the Cal Fire itself notes that this doesn't mean that they're actually, clearing over 100,000 separate acres. As I said earlier, there's usually some combination of different kinds of treatment applied. So they might do mastication and thinning. They might do multiple overlapping kinds of treatment, and that all gets counted. So you could have areas that are counted many, many times. It can contribute multiple times to the treatment total. So it's not really clear how many acres are really being treated. It could be a very small number. We don't know. The state reports that it did about 51,000 acres of controlled burns. So which is good. They finally are meeting their 50,000 acre a year goal. But again, it's not really clear if that's okay. Did they do brush clearance before to reduce the risk of uncontrolled fire from the prescribed burns? And these are all very small numbers. As I said, there are millions and millions of acres. There's in total, I believe, about 15 million acres. So if in reality we're only thinning, somewhere between 51,000 and maybe 120, 130, 140,000 acres a year, that's a very small number compared to what we would need to do to reduce risk.
Now, the state budget spending on wildfire prevention has it's gone up. It's gone back down. Can you tell us more about what's going on there?
Yeah, so when Governor Newsom came into office in 2019, the state was spending $200 million a year on wildfire prevention. The 2020 to 2021 budget increased it to $536 million. The 21 to 22 budget increased it again to $908 million. Those were some really large improvements in the amount of spending relative to the risk that we have in the state. But then funding has since declined. We just haven't been allocating as much money to forest management, despite the budget growing to a new record every year, pretty much. Right, the funding declined to $600 million in between 22 and 23. Stayed at about that same level for 23-24. Declined again to $543 million in 24-25. And this year, in our record $321 billion budget, it's fallen back to $210 million, which, because of inflation, is actually less money than it was in 2019. It would have had to have been about $250 million this year to keep up with 2019 levels. So we're funding less than we were even before. And, Republicans have tried to keep, baseline funding at $1 billion a year, because they generally do represent more rural or suburban districts where the populations are closest to the wildland urban interface where there is the most risk. I do want to focus, though, quickly on, some independent estimates on the cost of actually treating every single acre of at-risk land in California. The Resources for the Future says it would cost $17 billion to treat every single acre. Or if we were just focused on the highest risk areas on that wildland urban interface I talked about, between the wild and people's homes, that would only cost $5 billion. For context, we have something called the cap and trade program, where we're raising $3 to $4 billion a year, taxing companies for their greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gases aren't generally, toxic. Like carbon dioxide isn't like pollution, right? But you still have to buy allowances for that, and that raises $3 to $4 billion a year into the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Unfortunately, the state's wildfires are some of the biggest causes of greenhouse gas emissions in the state, and even the 2018 fires let out as much carbon dioxide as the previous 2 decades of greenhouse gas emissions reductions from our spending of hundreds of billions of dollars on greenhouse gas reductions technology. So it's really unclear why, when we could just get rid of the risk to humans and human structures in less than 2 years of greenhouse gas reduction funding through cap and trade, or for $17 billion, we could just have zero wildfire risk, and we would have a massive emissions reduction, not to mention air quality. People can't breathe on days like this. I have friends with asthma. They can't go outside. They can't do anything outside when it is so smoky from this. And it can't be good for people, for us to keep going outside when we have these fires that are so large and so uncontrolled because we just won't invest the resources in it.
So you're talking about fuels reduction. Is there anywhere a history of this working in California?
Yeah, so there was a fire exactly like the Palisades Fire in 2020, but it was in Orange County where they actually had really strict fuels reduction rules. So the Silverado Fire, they also had extremely high winds, 85-mile-an-hour winds went into the Orchard Hills, but there was a strict rule of a 200-foot defensible space between the wildlands and people's homes and structures. So that fire burned 14,000 acres, which is, a little more than half the size of the Palisades Fire. But remember how the Palisades Fire, there were about almost 7,000 structures lost? Only 5 were lost in the Silverado Fire, despite that much more being burned, because that was just chaparral that burned mostly. That California scrubland that is supposed to burn pretty often did burn. And the defensible space ended up being really successful. No one died in that fire compared to the 13 who lost their lives in the Palisades Fire. Sorry, compared to the 12 who lost their lives in the Palisades Fire.
All right. And then move to the next one.
Yeah, but that's in the past. I think now we're really focusing on what the state is doing moving forward.
Speaking of moving forward, we're now 6 months after the Palisades and the Eaton fires. So what is California Governor Gavin Newsom doing now?
Well, he unveiled $101 billion in funding for, quote, multifamily low-income housing development that will, quote, contribute to a more equitable and resilient Los Angeles, end quote. The priority is for geographic proximity to the fire perimeters of the Eaton, Hughes, and Palisades fires. The translation of that is there's this, quote, rebuilding aid that will put, multifamily low-income housing, aka rent-controlled housing, for low-income people into the areas that were destroyed by the fires, with the funding priority based on how close you are to where the fire was. Understandably, maybe some people are not going to be happy about this. And this ties into a lot of existing rules within California regarding what homes have to be available for who at what income level if they get destroyed by the fire. And what kind of projects are able to be funded under these grants. So
this $101 million, what kind of projects can it fund?
So there's a few different main groups here. There's the multifamily housing program, which is just, general low-income housing. Then there is supportive housing for people who are exiting institutional settings or homelessness. Institutional settings includes a mental institute or prison. So this means convicts. And there's something called transit-oriented development that gives a density boost in your transit stops. So if you have, for example, enough frequency on a bus stop, then that qualifies for a boost in the number of units you can build, so long as you include enough quote unquote affordable housing. When people say affordable housing as members of the government, that is a technical term that applies to income thresholds and the maximum amount of rent that can be charged based on the different income thresholds based on the criteria. It doesn't mean just housing that people can afford. It is a technical term that people seem to use very misleadingly. This also, one of the grants, though, is for veteran and homeless veteran housing. I don't anticipate the veteran and homeless veteran housing to really have as much pushback as some of those other options, especially the supportive housing. And notably, it is possible to stack funding. So, but you could probably have a development that includes multiple components of these projects.
Well, thank you, Kenneth. We will continue to cover these and more stories, which listeners can keep up with at thecentersquare.com. Thank you for listening to California in Focus.